The self-stranger here. You may think you've lost motivation, but what if motivation isn't the problem? What if you've simply spent so much time becoming who everyone else needs you to be that you've forgotten who you actually are? There is a moment almost everyone has experienced, but almost no one talks about. You are lying in bed, phone dead or forgotten in the other room, television off, no music playing, and for a few seconds there is nothing between you and your own mind. And in that moment, something strange happens. A low hum of discomfort rises up from somewhere you cannot name. Your thoughts start to feel too loud. Your body gets restless. And within seconds, without even deciding to, your hand is reaching for something. Anything to make the silence stop. Most people call this boredom. It is not boredom. It is something much older and much more revealing about who you actually are. In 2014, a team of psychologists led by Timothy Wilson ran an experiment that has quietly become one of the most unsettling studies in modern psychology. They took ordinary people, put them alone in a bare room with nothing to do but think, and asked them to simply sit with their thoughts for 15 minutes. No phone, no book, no task. Just them and their own mind. Many participants reported the experience as unpleasant, but the real twist came in the follow-up. The researchers gave participants the option to give themselves a mild electric shock during that period of solitude, something they had earlier said they would pay money to avoid. A significant number of people, especially men, chose to shock themselves rather than sit quietly with their own thoughts for even a few minutes. Let that sink in. People chose physical pain over mental stillness. This is not a story about boredom. This is a story about what happens when a person is forced to meet themselves without a mask, without a distraction, without an escape route, and finds that meeting unbearable. So why is being alone with your own mind so threatening? To understand this, we have to go back to what solitude actually does to the brain. When you remove external stimulation, your mind does not go quiet. It goes inward. This is when what psychologists call the default mode network activates, the neural system responsible for self-referential thought, memory, and reflection on your own identity. In other words, silence does not empty your mind. It opens a door, and behind that door are the things you have been avoiding, the conversation you never finished, the version of yourself you gave up on, the choice you made out of fear instead of desire, the grief you postponed because you were too busy to feel it. Solitude does not create these things. It simply removes the noise that was covering them. Most people structure their entire lives around never opening that door. Every notification, every scroll, every autoplay video, every background podcast is functioning as a psychological seal, keeping that door shut. So the self-confrontation never has to happen. This is why the average person checks their phone dozens, sometimes over 100 times a day. It is not really about information. It is about avoidance. The phone has become the modern equivalent of the self-shock button. Anything to avoid sitting with the raw, unfiltered signal of your own mind. Here is where it gets more uncomfortable. The discomfort you feel in silence is not random, it is specific. If solitude was simply neutral, you would feel nothing when the noise stopped. Instead, you feel something rising, something that has weight and shape, and often a very particular emotional flavor. For some people, it is anxiety, a sense that something is wrong, that they cannot locate. For others, it is a low-grade sadness that seems to come from nowhere. For others, it is a restless irritability, as if their own mind has become an itch they cannot scratch. Whatever form it takes, this reaction is not the problem. It is a signal, and the signal is pointing at something specific. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at directly because they threaten the story we tell about who we are. He believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Silence is one of the few conditions where the unconscious gets loud enough to be heard. That is exactly why it is so uncomfortable. You are not just sitting in quiet. You are standing at the edge of a room full of things you have spent years learning not to look at. This is also why constant busyness has become such a socially rewarded trait in modern life. Somewhere along the way, being busy became a proxy for being important, for being disciplined, for being a person of value. But look closer and a different pattern emerges. A lot of busyness is not productivity. It is architecture. It is the deliberate, often unconscious construction of a life with no gaps in it, because gaps are where the self shows up uninvited. Fill every hour with tasks, and there is no hour left over in which you might have to ask yourself whether any of it means anything, whether you are becoming who you actually want to be, or whether you are simply running on a track someone else built for you a long time ago. There is a particular kind of person who has structured their entire identity around output, work, achievement, optimization, self-improvement content consumed on a loop. On the surface, this looks like discipline. Underneath it is often something else entirely, a sophisticated form of avoidance dressed up as ambition. Because if you are always improving, always working toward the next version of yourself, you never actually have to sit still and ask who you are right now, today, without the projects and the plans and the 5-year vision. The irony is that this constant forward motion, which looks like growth from the outside, can actually be one of the most effective ways to avoid the very self-knowledge that would make growth meaningful in the first place. You cannot build an authentic life on top of a self you have never actually met. Existential psychologists have a term for a specific kind of dread tied to this. They call it ontological anxiety, the deep unease that arises when a person confronts the raw fact of their own existence without the roles and routines that usually cushion it. Job titles, relationship labels, daily schedules, these things give you a sense of solid ground. Strip them away, even for 15 minutes of silence, and you are standing on something much less certain, which is simply the fact that you exist, that you are going to die, and that in between those 2 points, you are responsible for constructing meaning out of raw, unstructured time. That is a heavy thing to face. It makes sense that most people would rather check their phone. But here is the part that most people never get to, because they never make it through the discomfort long enough to find it. The same silence that surfaces your fear also surfaces your clarity. The two live in the same room. You cannot get access to one without walking past the other. This is why so many people who go through periods of forced solitude, whether by choice through meditation retreats and long solo trips, or by circumstance through illness, loss, or isolation, describe a strange pattern. First comes the discomfort, sometimes intense. Then, if they stay with it instead of fleeing, something shifts. The noise starts to settle. And underneath the noise is not nothing, it is signal. A clearer sense of what actually matters to them, stripped of the performance they have been putting on for other people, and often for themselves. Viktor Frankl, writing from inside one of the darkest circumstances a human being can survive, observed that everything can be taken from a person except one thing, the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That freedom is only accessible to someone who has actually met themselves. You cannot choose who you want to be in relation to your life if you have never sat still long enough to find out who you already are. So what do you actually do with this? Not as a productivity hack, not as another item on a self-improvement checklist, but as a real practice. The first step is deceptively simple and deeply uncomfortable. Sit in silence without your phone for a length of time that feels slightly too long. Not to relax, not to meditate in the aesthetic sense you see online, just to notice what comes up when the noise stops. Do not try to fix it or fight it, just notice it, the way you would notice weather. This is a thought, this is a feeling, this is a memory surfacing. Let it move through instead of reaching for the shock button. The goal is not comfort. The goal is familiarity, building a relationship with your own mind instead of a lifelong avoidance of it. The second thing is to get curious about your specific escape patterns. Everyone has them. For some, it is the phone. For others, it is overworking, overeating, over-exercising, endless socializing, constant background noise. None of these things are inherently bad. The question is not whether you do them. The question is whether you can stop doing them, even briefly, without a wave of anxiety pushing you back toward them. If you cannot, that resistance is data. It is telling you exactly where the unmet parts of yourself are living. The third thing, and maybe the most important, is to stop treating self-confrontation as something you graduate from. This is not a problem you solve once. It is a practice you return to, the way you return to exercise or sleep. The people who seem the most solid, the most quietly confident, the ones who do not seem to need constant external validation to feel okay, are not the people who have avoided this process. They are the ones who have gone through it enough times that the room is no longer unfamiliar. The silence does not disappear. It just stops being an enemy. The real reason you cannot sit alone with yourself is not that solitude is empty. It is that solitude is full of everything you have been too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to look at directly. The noise of modern life is not an accident. It is a shield. And like most shields, it protects you from something real. But it also keeps you from something real, from the version of yourself that only shows up when you stop running. You do not need more information to become that person. You do not need another routine, or another app, or another 5-step plan. You need 15 minutes of silence, repeated often enough that it stops being a threat and starts being a homecoming. Because the relationship you have with yourself, the one you have been avoiding in every scroll and every notification, is the one relationship you will never be able to leave. The only real question is whether you get to know it on your own terms or whether it waits for you in the dark, growing louder, until one day you have no choice but to listen. If this video made you realize there's a part of yourself you've been ignoring, I've created a free 7-day self-discovery reset. It's designed to help you slow down, ask better questions, and understand yourself a little more clearly. You'll find it below.